So, geology. What is it? When was it born, and how did it develop? This is what we will cover in this short video narrative. Scientists and their theories, the controversies surrounding the theories, and the scientific limitations that go along with them. The scientific definition of geology is the science that deals with the dynamics and physical history of the earth, the rocks of which it is composed, and the physical, chemical, and biological changes that the earth has undergone or is undergoing. Or just the study of rocks and stuff on the earth's surface. However, this was not always the case. The science did not appear before James Hutton. Now, this was a time of great scientific discoveries. James Hutton was the first scientist to study what we now call geology. He's the father of the science. Now, James Hutton was a man of keen insights and lively conversation. Although a dynamic character, his writings were completely incoherent. So when he attempted to address the issue of why ancient clamshells and other marine fossils were so often found on mountaintops in front of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, which was a rather prominent scientific society that still exists today, it sounded a little like this.
The world which we inhabit is composed of the materials, not of the earth, which was the immediate predecessor of the present, but of the earth which in ascending from the present we consider as the third, and which had preceded the land that was above the surface of the sea, while our present land was yet beneath the water of the ocean.
Say what?
Needless to say, it was completely disregarded by the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Prior to his studies, people had tried to prove that hills and mountains were once submerged underwater, or at least this was the prevalent idea, because no one could explain how those clamshells got up there.
There are two opposing views regarding the topic. The main view are the Neptunists, who believe that everything on Earth, including seashells and high altitudes, could be explained by rising and falling sea levels. They were convinced that mountains and hills always existed and were changed only by water, when water sloshed over them in periods of global flooding. The opposing view is that of Plutonists. They criticize the Neptunists' view by asking awkward questions about the origin of the large quantities of water the Neptunists used in their explanations. They believe that the Earth experienced profound internal and surface forces. These were what caused the changes on the Earth's surface. Hutton, however, from looking at down at his own farmland, could see that soil was created by the erosion of rocks, and that particles of the soil were continually carried away by streams and rivers and redeposited everywhere. He realized that if such a process continued over large periods of time, the Earth would eventually have a smooth surface where everywhere around him there were hills. He decided that the clamshells and marine fossils had not been deposited with floods but had risen along with mountains themselves. These theories, however, indicated that these processes could only take place over extremely long periods of time, beyond anyone's imagination. Such insights could utterly change our understanding of Earth. Fortunately for the science of geology, Hutton had a close friend, who was also a professor of mathematics at the University of Edinburgh, who actually understood that Hutton was trying to say and published a clarified version of Hutton's work in a book called Illustrations of the Huttonian Theory of the Earth. At the beginning of the 19th century, geological studies had become very popular, so much that a dining club known as the Geological Society was formed, which consisted mainly of a group of men who had the money and time to spend on a somewhat professional level. But this was not limited merely to all retired men who were interested in science, but it was also quite fashionable at the time to take an interest in geology, as books and lectures on geological concepts were sold out on a regular basis. As the time passed, this was referred to as stone breaking. The scientific field attracted some great names to the field, such as Richard Murchison and James Parkinson, who is known for his studies on what is now known as Parkinson's disease.
Most important of these scientists was Charles Lyell, who back in the day was considered the modern-day James Hutton. It was Reverend William Buckland that drew Charles Lyell into the study of geology and triggered his lifelong devotion to geology. He, ironically, was born the same year that Hutton passed away, and was born rather close to Hutton's village. Lyell obtained his interest in nature from his father, who studied mosses and nature in general, as well as poetry. However, this interest solidified when he went to study in Oxford University. It was there, under the eccentric but brilliant Reverend William Buckland, who studied fossilized species, that Lyell really became inspired with geology and paleontology. Lyell possessed an intelligent brain, but would eventually lose his eyesight. This, however, did not affect or diminish his achievements and contributions to geology. He produced the Principles of Geology in 3 volumes between 1830 and 1833, which were inspired by Hutton's line of thought. He also taught geology at King's College, which was the only real job he had. Lyell was also quite peculiar. When deep in thought, he would take improbable positions on furniture, such as resting his head on a chair while standing up. Now another controversy appeared, and it echoed the previous controversy of Neptunians versus Plutonians, but this one was between the catastrophists and the uniformists, and we personally believe this sounds much more exciting. Although similar to their predecessors, they were different in many ways. The only similarity was that the catastrophists believed that short cataclysmic events, which were generally floods, were what shaped the earth, while the uniformists believed in a gradual approach over millions of years. Of course, discussions of Noah and the flood were thrown in there too. Lyell was a uniformist and thought catastrophists took the easy way to explaining things and did not have proper curiosity. However, there were limitations to Lyell. For example, completely neglected rivers of ice, which are also known as glaciers, and he also neglected ice ages. We think he didn't like ice very much. He also cancelled out the idea of how mountains were formed and the idea of extinction in both plants and animals.
Here things get confusing, so bear with us. Trying to classify these rocks, fossils, and stuff like that was very hard, and many people fought over it. The Great Devonian Controversy, for example, was started when Reverend Adam Sedgwick of Cambridge claimed the rock to be Cambrian, while another scholar, Murchison, thought it to belong to the Silurian. In the end, they ended up creating a new theory in a new era, called the Ordovician. This didn't happen so easily, and without many insults on both parts. A geological timeline was established in order to chronologically place all the natural events occurring on Earth, and also to organize the ages of particular fossils and rocks. This method of organization helped scientists get an idea of what creatures lived in what time, and how their particular lifestyles were. Originally, geological history was divided into 4 spans of time: primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. Charles Lyell, in his book Principles, introduced additional subcategories called epochs, such as Pleistocene, Pliocene, Miocene, and the particularly vague Oligocene period. Nowadays, geological time is subdivided into 4 main eras: Precambrian, Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. These 4 eras are then individually divided into more than 20 subgroups called periods. Those periods are then divided into epochs. The almost limitless subdivisions altogether create a rather complex timeline, and scientists have ensured that not a single epoch intersects with another on the timeline. In 1879, due to the British being the most active nation in the geological field, most geological periods were named after tribes in the United Kingdom. For example, Devonian comes from the English country of Devon. Cambrian comes from the Roman name for Wales. Ordovician and Silurian recall ancient Welsh tribes, the Ordovices and the Silures. Jurassic refers to the Jura Mountains in France and Switzerland. Interestingly, geological timeline organization varies from one textbook to the other. One of the theories put forth that was seen as interesting until today was the theory of Archbishop James Ussher of the Church of Ireland after carefully studying the Bible. He stated that the earth had been created at midday on October the 23rd, 4004 BC. This naturally sparked a debate about using the Bible for this area in science. Now began the quest to discover how ancient the earth really was. The first theory was put forth in 1715 by Edmund Halley, who wanted to calculate the amount of salt in the sea added each year and divide that by the total number of salt. However, no one knew how much salt there was and how much had been added, so that theory was not very helpful. The next scientific theory arrived in 1770. It was made by the Frenchman Georges Louis Leclerc, Comte de Buffon. This time he tried to use the idea of the earth radiating heat. He conducted an experiment where he heated spheres of orbs until they glowed white hot and tried to estimate heat loss by touching them very lightly until they cooled. His number, which was from 75,000 to 168,000 years old, was a wild underestimate, but it was a radical idea nonetheless, and was branded heretical. He apologized for it, but continued to cheerfully imply in his future writings. This was of course then refuted by Darwin, who estimated that an area of the UK took 306,662,400 years to complete. It was so shocking that it was removed from the third edition of the book, but this did not take away the fact that no one could calculate the age of the Earth. Finally, we have Lord Kelvin, who has nothing short of a genius. He got into university to study mathematics at the age of 10, and by the time he reached his 20s, he'd studied in France and England, as well as graduating from Cambridge. I won't list his achievements, but he came up with many brilliant theories in electromagnetism, thermodynamics, wave theory of light, scales of temperatures, working with refrigerators and telegrams, to name a few. His only shortcoming, on the other hand, was the inability to calculate the age of the Earth. He had wild ranges such as a minimum 20 million years, probably 98 million years, but maybe 400 million years. They then got more varied, 100 million years, 500 million years, and finally 24 million years in 1897. They just couldn't figure out how the sun could burn for so long without exhausting its fuel. This meant that the planets in the sun should be relatively youthful, but of course, fossil evidence proved them wrong.